All right, so this is going to be a somewhat more contemporary take on media politics to finish up this module. And again, always read our text. They do a very nice job in chapter 11 talking about the history and the politics of the media. So they're going to be able to provide a lot more detail than I can provide in these slides, okay, or the videos. So, fourth estate, right? That's media at its best. And when I say media, I mean all the different manifestations, from newspapers and online newspapers to cable television, to broadcast television, to radio, FM and AM. Just all the many manifestations of media is what we're talking about here. And it was Thomas Jefferson. Now, back in the late 18th century, late 1700s, right? The only kind of media we really had were newspapers. And as noted in that historical material that we've already covered, early days newspapers were either allied with the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists. And then a bit later, right, either allied with the Federalists or the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. And there was nothing in between. So those who think that partisan newspapers are something new don't know their American history. So Jefferson, right, said if forced to choose between no government and no press, he would choose the former, right? He would choose no government over no press. Now, was he being a bit dramatic? Yeah, he was. Right. But his point was good. His point was that you cannot have a functioning republic or constitutional democracy without an independent media. Now, I'm not saying we need a perfect media, because we're never going to have that. Right? We're never going to have that. Our media is always going to be terribly flawed. But what's critical, right, is that it's independent from the government. Independent, right? So they can provide critical coverage of the government, and for that matter, corporations and powerful individuals. Right? We need that critical coverage so that we can get information about these entities so that we can hold them accountable. Right? It's almost like we have four branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial, and media. Right? That's how central the media is to a democracy. You cannot have a democracy, right, without things like free and fair elections, free speech, limits on the power of the government, and an independent media. It's that important. It's completely central to the possibility of constitutional democracy. All right. Fourth estate. It helps hold these powerful entities accountable to we the people. Now that does put a burden right on we the people to be aware of what's going on around them by consuming good media. And we don't always do that. Kind of like with our food diet, right? We often consume foods that are not good for us. And we know that, but we do it anyway for a variety of reasons. Right? Kind of the same thing with the media. We often consume really bad media. And that does not strengthen our democracy. It can actually weaken it, such as, we're kind of seeing today with the rise of, especially with the internet and social media, where you often get lots of falsehoods and conspiracy theories that are utterly baseless, and yet tens of millions of Americans buy into it. Very disturbing. Very disturbing. It's also true, right, that the media sometimes, so in other words, right, we the people bear some responsibility for making media work. People like to just sort of point their finger at the media. Well, come on, how about we the people? Aren't they implicated in the media? I'm pretty sure they are, in all sorts of ways. So don't let we the people off the hook too easily, people. And sometimes, right, the media can be a lapdog. It can be a little too cooperative with high government officials, or with corporate CEOs, or with other powerful private individuals. Right? It can be too friendly, too cooperative, not adversarial enough, like a lapdog. We don't want a lapdog. We want a guard dog for our media. Right? We want a guard dog. All right, let's get a little more specific now, and let's break it down to the extent that we the people get their information about politics from the media, which is pretty much universally true. Right? Very few of us go and observe firsthand the workings of Congress or a city council or whatever. We find out about it through the media. What about the specific sources? Television is still the 800-pound gorilla. Reports of its demise have been greatly exaggerated. This is still where most people get their news about politics. The internet, we'll get to later, that's a rising star, no question about it, but still television dominates this particular part of our politics. And we'll see that often some of those internet websites where people go are related to television stations like foxnews.com, msnbc.com, abcnews.com. You get the idea. All right, so television. What is characteristic of television? The broadcasts. ABC, NBC, CBS, I think Fox now as well. Not Fox News, but Fox. I think that's considered one of the big players now as well. Right? They broadcast to a very large audience, not nearly what it used to be back in the day, but still they broadcast, as the name implies, to a very large audience. And this is still where most people turn to for their TV news. Rising and more diverse and also more niche, cable television, right? Fox News, MSNBC, and a host of other channels. When I was a kid, you had 3 channels, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Now, of course, you got a few more than that, and a lot of these are cable. What can cable channels do? They don't need the same audience that broadcast does. Broadcast these days, the news programs, they need about 15, 12 million people to be viable. What does cable need to be viable? Probably fewer than 1 million. If you get 1 million, that's a big deal. 2 million, that's a very big deal. So cable is significant, especially when you aggregate all the cable channels together. But no one individual cable channel even approaches the big 4 of broadcast. So keep that in mind. Now, that being said, narrowcasting or niche cable television, right? Fox News devotes their coverage to conservatives. MSNBC tends to satisfy liberals. And we'll see that that's an issue. Often people now will simply consume the media that they find most simpatico with their own political views. I'm not sure that's always useful, but it's, I think, often the case. Back in the day when I was a kid, you listened to old Uncle Walter Cronkite, and you didn't have a lot of other options. So everybody listened to Walter Cronkite. And if he wasn't liberal enough for you, too damn bad. If he wasn't conservative enough for you, too damn bad. These days, right, if you don't want to hear something that's liberal, you check out Fox News. If you don't want to hear conservative views, check out MSNBC. Comedy, headed out the door now, or maybe out the door, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Yes, he does comedy, and he's, as he always says, not a real journalist, but many would say his comedic takes on the news are often deeply insightful. Studies have shown that consumers of shows like The Colbert Report and The Daily Show are more knowledgeable about politics than the average American citizen. Also worth noting about television, increasingly, especially cable, you get a lot of punditry. I'm going to argue that there's a difference between news gathering and news commentary. Increasingly popular because it's cheap, easy, and entertaining. Commentary, right? Basically, the hosts like a Chris Matthews or a Sean Hannity, they essentially read a variety of important newspapers and then they talk about that news. They provide commentary, liberal, conservative, somewhere in between, right? Punditry. There's room for punditry. It is entertaining. It is useful to get a perspective on the news, but at some point, right, somebody has to do the news gathering. It's not sexy. It's not as entertaining. It's expensive. It's time consuming, but bloody hell, somebody has to do it. Everybody cannot be a commentator. You have to have something to commentate on. So I'm a little worried about that, the rise of all of these talking heads who no longer, who don't gather news. They simply comment on it. That's inexpensive. It's fun. It's amusing, but it doesn't get news gathering done. It doesn't. That's true of television, but we'll see it's also true of radio. It's true of the internet. It's true of all the various media platforms. Okay, what else? Some would say TV is not fantastic, right? It depends more on image and less on substance. It relies heavily on sound bites. It is a relatively passive medium, right? It doesn't require much active participation by the viewer.
So maybe not ideal, although I think, television news done well is good stuff, perfectly fine for providing we the people information they need to hold government accountable. Now, TV news is not always at its best, but that's true of all the media platforms. Radio, FM and AM here, FM and AM. FM, high fidelity, mostly music. AM, low fidelity, mostly talk radio. FM does have some talk radio. They have some important, I would argue, some important news programs. They have NPR, National Public Radio, although it's less public than it used to be. Little government support, mostly support from listeners like you, support from a lot of corporate sponsors and nonprofit foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank heavens they provide that support. But it means that what we call public radio often has a strong private component. Why do these private corporations want to sponsor FM talk radio that's public? Because the listenership is relatively affluent, relatively educated, have a lot of discretionary dollars to spend, super attractive to corporations. All Things Considered is the afternoon program, news gathering mostly. Morning edition, excellent. A lot of the power brokers in DC, Republican and Democratic, listen to those programs. They're pretty fantastic. 88.9 on your FM dial here in the Valley, people. That also includes KNPR, which does things that are specifically about Nevada. Great stuff there, great stuff. It's almost all news gathering. Some commentary, mostly news gathering. Good hard work there. It takes a lot of money though, right? Bureaus across the world, bureaus across the country, people on the ground collecting information. Okay, there's that. Although some people, of course, deride FM radio, NPR, as being too liberal, maybe in previous decades, but I would argue in the last 20, 30 years, conservatives have done a great job at raising those questions and essentially forcing public radio to move in a more centrist direction. So if you haven't listened to it in a while, check it out. See what you think about it. It's generally, I would say, very, very high quality. Okay, AM radio, right? That's dominated by conservatives. No question about it. This is where Rush Limbaugh hangs out. Still the main man when it comes to talk radio. Still the 800-pound gorilla. Huge listenership. Hugely profitable show. We hear less about him these days, but he's still doing it. Taking care of business. He's a commentator. He's a pundit. Sean Hannity, Michael Savage, I'm sure a host of others. I lose track. Laura Schlesinger, blah, blah, blah. Mostly conservative, almost all conservative. Making it very clear that they're there to provide conservative commentary on the news. And again, I have nothing against pundits per se, but at times it feels to me like the cart is pulling the horse. The horse is news gathering. The cart is commentary. At least on AM radio, it's all cart, no horse. Somebody's got to be the horse here. I know it's not very exciting or sexy to be the horse. Somebody's got to be the horse. We can't all just commentate on the news. Somebody has to gather the news. So that would be one of my knocks on AM radio is no serious attempt to gather news. Okay. Newspapers, they're my favorite. Old school paper copies, my favorite. But honestly, they're in decline. Older people consume newspapers pretty much as they always have. Even the old school paper copies, young people, not so much, right? Not so much. What has that meant for newspapers? The revenue model has become very, very challenging. Hard to raise much revenue when you're mostly trying to sell internet ads by people visiting your newspaper on the web, where we expect information to be free, but producing that information is definitely not free. So that's been difficult for our premier newspapers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Right? They're trying to maintain a viable revenue model. They used to make all their revenue, most of it from selling ads in newspapers, old school paper copies. That's increasingly difficult to do because fewer and fewer people read the newspapers in that way. They want to look at it on the internet and they don't expect to get charged. The Wall Street Journal, I believe, has been hardcore about that. They say, then too damn bad, you can't read our stories. New York Times, a little more open to allowing some free content. But it's hard to get people to pay for that on the internet. They don't expect it. They don't want it. You can sell internet ads, but it doesn't replace newspaper ads. It does not. So newspaper are under big threat. And here's the thing. They do provide most of our news gathering. 80 to 85% of news gathering is done by newspapers. They're the ones under most threat from the rising internet. That's been super difficult in the newspaper industry. What do we have here in Las Vegas that's highly unusual? Two major newspapers, although they're sort of combined these days, backroom operations, distributed simultaneously. The Las Vegas Review-Journal, conservative and Republican. The Las Vegas Sun, liberal and Democratic. So we get both points of view, if you will. That's unusual. Most cities get one newspaper, if that. That's old school paper copy. If you only have one, you get what you get. If it's liberal, that's all you get. And if it's conservative, that's all you get. New York Times, we would say, our premier national newspaper, liberal. The Wall Street Journal are, I would say, almost as good as the New York Times, although they focus more on business. That's cool. They're also a premier national newspaper. USA Today kind of sucks in my view, but it is a national newspaper. Wall Street Journal, fairly conservative. USA Today, centrist. That being said, people, check it out. If you're looking at, let's say, the New York Times, their news gathering stories, which is most of the paper, hard to see that it's liberal or conservative. It's just good news gathering. Same for the Wall Street Journal. I love that newspaper. I'm a liberal. I love the Wall Street Journal. They do world-class reporting on a variety of political and financial issues. Their news gathering stories, pretty damn straight up. It's either good or it's not good. Now, how do they become known as liberal or conservative? Their editorial pages, which is different from their news gathering sections. Editorials, usually the very last 2 pages of the first section of the paper. On the left side, the editorials sponsored by the newspaper. Right? In the New York Times, pretty much all those editorials are liberal. Wall Street Journal, they're all conservative pretty much. On the right-hand side of that, the very last page of the first section, opinion pieces by various authors. The New York Times mostly hires liberals to write those, some conservatives, but mostly liberals. Wall Street Journal, just the opposite. They hire mostly conservatives to write those opinion pieces, but they do hire some liberals as well. That's how a paper gets defined as liberal or conservative. What do their editorials look like? What do their opinion pieces look like? I typically don't read editorials. They're not that interesting to me. They're kind of boilerplate and predictable. The opinion pieces to me are very interesting, liberal and conservative, and I enjoy the news gathering stories in both newspapers. So understand that about newspapers. Yeah, the New York Times is liberal, but you're not going to see much of that in most of the paper. Yeah, the Wall Street Journal is conservative, no question about that, but you're not going to really see that in much of the newspaper. Finally, the internet. It's presented a serious challenge to newspapers and other media platforms as well. People expect that information to be free. Producing it is definitely not free. People say the internet rules. To some extent that's true, although the most popular sites are ones that are affiliated with television stations like foxnews.com, msnbc.com, abc.com, cbs.com, NewYorkTimes.com, WallStreetJournal.com, affiliated with newspapers. So, yeah, the internet's a big deal, but a lot of those sites are spin-offs of other media platforms. Recognize that. The internet, you don't get a ton of news gathering there in and of itself. Maybe if it's part of a newspaper site, sure, like NewYorkTimes.com or WallStreetJournal.com, but otherwise, don't expect much news gathering. Or if you do get it from the internet, it might be unreliable news gathering by citizen journalists. And related to that, right, is the editorial hand of many internet sites pretty light? Can you make any damn claim you want to without being vetted? Sure, that's an issue with the internet, right? A lot of unreliable information, a lot of extremism. I mean, I'm all for niche targeting with your audience, but when that niche includes neo-Nazis or KKK, or whatever, or ISIS or Al-Qaeda, not impressed. And yet there it is, right? There's something for everybody out there on the internet, a little disturbing in some cases. All right, we're going to stop there. I'll do a second section on media politics. It'll take just a few minutes. All right, so that gives us a basic sense here of media functioning as kind of a platonic ideal form, right? Fourth estate, albeit in practice, as we've seen, media serve two masters, and I think that private master can distort their ability to be an effective fourth estate. Okay, so in some ways related to that, who owns the media in America? Who owns the major media? Large corporations. You'll see here from that little blurb from Wikipedia, in 1983, 90% of U.S. media controlled by 50 companies. Today, that same 90% controlled by 6 companies. Okay, quite a shift towards concentrated corporate ownership. Many would raise a very serious question about that. Is that healthy in a democracy where we want diverse sources of information when so much information is controlled by 6 large companies, six large corporations with their own vested interests, right? Presumably, the media that they own will be loath to be critical of those corporate owners. Conflict of interest, right? It's hard to serve two masters, public interest, private interest. And then many would argue, push comes to shove, the media will serve private interest before public interest. They need to satisfy those shareholders. They need to make quarterly profits and stay afloat financially. All right, so many would raise serious questions about this. Can we have concentrated corporate ownership of media and still have a free, fair, and independent media? It's a fair question to ask.